Okay, so let's move on. Really, the first part we just discussed was just the introduction to set up the stage to start talking about adaptation. So this is just the beginning now of the real presentation. And in one of the previous graphs, the one showing disasters, we saw how the number of disasters increased drastically in the last decade, 2000 to 2009. And that was real data. That was the number of people who got affected by floods, by storms. And it was pointed out correctly that the exponential growth there has to do a little bit with under-reporting happening in the past. But it also is important to realize, we also discussed that climate change was not the only factor affecting the shape of that graph, no? So more people affected by flooding or by landslides is not necessarily the result of climate change alone. And that's what this graph is about, okay? Have you seen this graph before in this course? Anybody showed it before? Who showed it? Yesterday, Maria Carmen or? Okay. Who? Marengo showed it. Oh, good. Okay, so you know about this graph, but we're going to review it. So it's good that you saw it before. So that way I don't have to explain it. You're going to explain it to me. Okay, so we go back to you talking, and I rest. So basically, the graph is showing the risk of being affected by a weather event. Okay? And who wants to start with the explanation? Somewhere around here? We have a microphone again? No. Oh, here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so who wants to start with the explanation? How do we come up with the risk of being affected by a weather event? Now in the center. We move it here to the center. Start moving it. And you stop it when when it goes to the other end. Okay, stop. Somewhere around there. Okay, what can you explain to us about the central part of that graph? How do we define risk of being... ¿Puede ser en español, no? Sí, lo puede hacer en español. Yeah. How do we define risk of being affected by extreme weather?
Okay, el riesgo es la multiplicación o la unión del peligro, la vulnerabilidad y la exposición, ¿no? Y la
Hold on. Risk is then derived from the intersection of the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. And what do we mean by hazard? ¿Qué es el peligro? There's a feedback.
Sí. ¿Qué es el peligro?
What do we have in the blue part on the side of the graph? What does that mean?
No veo.
The part that says hazard in blue.
Yes, in hazard.
Sí. What do we mean by hazard there?
No entiendo.
¿Peligro de qué? ¿Qué significa este peligro?
A los eventos, a la variabilidad natural y a los peligros antrópicos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sí.
So this part of the graph refers to the extreme events, no?
A los impactos, sí.
Sometimes we hear about desastres naturales, and people are moving away from that terminology, natural disasters, because the events are natural, the disasters are not, no? So on this side, we're talking about the event, what happens, no? The extreme rainfall, the drought, the freezing weather, the hot spells. So this is just the biophysical part of what is happening. So the biophysical part comes from two different sources. One is the natural variability of the climate, and two is the anthropogenic variability induced on the climate. Okay? So this is anthropogenic climate change, and this would be natural climate change. This is an interesting definition also. IPCC, when IPCC talks about climate change, it does not focus only on anthropogenic climate change. For IPCC, climate change means any variability, whether natural or anthropogenic.
Why do you say that the natural disaster doesn't exist? Imagine that one meteor impacts the Earth.
Encendámoslo. Ajá, okay.
In this situation, there are no anthropogenic
Factor.
factor.
Okay.
So it means that the natural disaster exists.
Yes.
So you can say
Okay.
that it doesn't.
Okay. So the point is that if the event is so huge that it covers the entire planet like a meteorite hitting the Earth, then it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter what we did in the past. We are all going to die anyway. So that's a huge disaster, and so there is no anthropogenic part to it. You're very right. If the natural event is so huge, it doesn't matter what we do. Now, here we're talking about events that are not so huge because we're talking about climate.
Yeah, but there are other examples, as hurricane.
Okay.
Hurricane is a natural disaster.
Okay.
It's not promoted by the human.
The-
It's, you know,
Yes.
the Earth wants to get the balance, and this is the way to transport energy
Sure.
from the tropics to the
Sure.
tropical areas.
So the hurricane is an event that is a natural event. Now, whether a hurricane translates into a disaster or not depends on the situation of human beings on the way to the disaster. And that is what this graph is showing. For example, let's think about a hurricane. That's an excellent example. So the hurricane is the hazard. That's the natural event. Now, whether the natural event is going to result in risk to human beings depends on two other factors, exposure and vulnerability. Let's give the example of Guatemala, which is the one I know the best. So I told you about 1998 Hurricane Mitch. Hurricane Mitch came, like most hurricanes in Guatemala, from the Caribbean, and so it entered the country from the eastern part. And the eastern part happens to be the least populated area of the country. And so the hurricane hit the country where there are fewer people, meaning the exposure was very low. And so the number of people affected by Hurricane Mitch, the number of people at risk from the hurricane was very low. And so the level of the natural disaster was low because the number of human beings on the way of the hurricane was low. On the other hand, we had another storm. We have two other storms, Agatha and Stan. Stan actually was an interesting one because Stan was, first of all, not a hurricane but a tropical storm. Only for one day before hitting shore, it was strong enough to be considered a hurricane. So it was a weak storm. It was a weak hurricane. It was a storm. And it never crossed Guatemala. It only crossed Mexico. So this storm never really entered the territory, but because it crossed Mexico close to the border of Guatemala, it so happens that the border of Mexico and Guatemala is the most populated area in the country. And so even though this hurricane never actually entered the country, it affected the area where most people live. And so the exposure there was extremely high. And so the disaster that this hurricane created was way higher than the disaster that the first hurricane created, even though the first hurricane, Mitch, entered the country and was way stronger. And so the event itself is natural, but the impact on humans will depend on the exposure and the vulnerability. Think about vulnerability now, and think about hurricanes. When a hurricane is coming through the Caribbean, it goes first on the ocean, and then there is a hurricane in the ocean, and most people don't even know about it. Why? Because there is no impact of that event on human lives, no? So when the hurricane is out in the middle of the ocean, the exposure is basically zero, and for the risk of having a human disaster is basically zero. Only when the hurricane enters an area where human beings live, then we increase the risk of having a disaster. And so the hurricane comes through the islands, and the first island that it usually finds is probably Haiti, no? Or probably Puerto Rico, no? And so the hurricane goes through Haiti. And next to Haiti is Dominican Republic, right? And so what happens in Haiti and what happens in Dominican Republic? How many people die in Haiti compared to how many people die in Dominican Republic? Well, it depends on the size of the hurricane, but most likely there are going to be tens or hundreds of people dying more in Haiti than in Dominican Republic. The exposure is the same, but the vulnerability is different, no? There are different situations in the society in the way that people are organized in Haiti than the way they are organized in Dominican Republic, and therefore the risk of the event result in very different outcomes, okay? So the hurricane is the same, the hazard was the same, the exposure was the same because the hurricane ripped through the island, but the vulnerability of the population was very different. Now, you spent 2 or 3 days already talking about vulnerability, so you are experts in vulnerability. So you can explain to me why Dominican Republic was less affected than Haiti. You want to explain or you want a question?
No, I just want to see if I can conceptualize in a simpler way because it's tricky. Because you have sort of hierarchical structure to it, but there is just 2D. You don't see too much the hierarchy, I guess. So can we think risk as the likelihood of having an impact, of being affected by something? Because it can be from 0 to 1. 1, it's really, I got really impact, and 0, I have 0 risk. Like the likelihood of having being affected somehow.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Yes. And this is important, and I forgot to say this about this graph, but because you told me that you had already seen the graph. This graph is, even though it's relatively simple, it's a revolutionary concept in adaptation. In the previous IPCC report in 2007, the 4th report, this graph did not exist. And in previous thinking, climate change people were thinking just about climate change, and they didn't realize that we had all these people that had a lot of experience in risk management that could help a lot. Because climate change people realize, well, we are dealing with extreme events. We are dealing with extreme events that can turn into a disaster. And we already have a lot of people who are experts in disaster management. So a big event occurred in 2012, I think it was, and that the IPCC convened a group of experts on climate change and put them together with a group of experts on risk management. And they came together to work a report, and one of the main outcomes was this graph, okay? So even though it looks like a simple graph, it really took a lot of thinking to come up with the graph, and it's really an important step in how we approach climate change. Because basically what we did here was realize that, okay, climate change is dealing with extreme events. Extreme events can result in disasters, but we already know a lot about disasters. So why don't we approach climate change from the perspective of risk management? And this is what we are doing here. And like our friend here was pointing out, another advantage of doing this is not only that we're gaining all the experience from the people from risk management. When we talk about risk, we are talking about probability. And when we talk about probability, we are talking about a number from 0 to 1. And that kind of analysis is very friendly to economists, and it's also very friendly to people in insurance because they already are very used to handling that kind of information. And so when we translated the climate change information and put it into risk language, we already gained a lot of opening with economists and with people dealing with insurance. And so that opened up a wide range of people who before were not involved with climate change. So that was a big step, linking up the risk management community with the climate change community. And basically realizing that the risk or the probability of being affected by an extreme event not only comes from the extreme event itself, but it comes from how many people are exposed to that extreme event, and it also comes from what kind of society, what kind of community we have in that people who are being exposed to the extreme event.
Morning, Professor. Good morning, everyone.
Microphone? Do we have a microphone? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you explain me what is the relationship between SDG, Sendai, and climate change? Because I can see in any IPCC report this relationship.
Okay. So she's asking about the objectives that the United Nations set up as development goals for the world. And she's also asking about the Sendai initiative, which deals with risk management. So the Sendai initiative is the equivalent to the Climate Change Convention, no? And so these are two political initiatives at the global level. And the same way that the scientific community on climate change was separated from the scientific community that deals with risk management, unfortunately, these two initiatives are still working in parallel ways. And so right now, United Nations is working to try to bring these two groups to work together. So, for example, the Sendai initiative is called Sendai because it was signed in Japan, the city of Sendai. And they have yearly meetings. They just had a meeting in Cancun earlier this year. And so they bring people together to make decisions on how to manage risk. And then every year also we have people coming together to make decisions on how to adapt to climate change. And so it's just common sense to have these two groups of people working together. Now it's common sense, but it's not easy to do. So United Nations is working on that process. And at the country level, the same situation. I can give you the example from Guatemala that I know the best. In Guatemala, disaster risk management is done by one government institution, CONRED is called, no? the Council for Reduction of Disasters. And then climate change is dealt with institutions from the environmental sector. So the Ministry of Environment is the focal point for climate change. And so you have two government institutions dealing with two different conventions signed to the United Nations. And you will think, well, these two people are going to talk because they both are dealing with disasters. One coming from climate change and the other one coming from any other source, including climate change. But the bottom line is that they don't really talk well to each other. And so the bottom line is that, yes, risk management and all this road that we have already walked through in terms of dealing with risk is very important, and we need to learn more and we need to integrate more with climate change management. And this graph is the first attempt to do that. Now, you were also asking about the development goals. That's a even more recent initiative from United Nations. No, that was signed 2 years ago, I think. One of the development goals is to fight against climate change. But beyond that, there are other development goals. And more people are realizing that they are all linked up together. And we're going to see that in the next slides. No? If we talk about adaptation to climate change, we really are talking about dealing with vulnerability. And like you were discussing yesterday with Mari Carmen, dealing with vulnerability has to do a lot with dealing in how society organizes itself, how we deal with other problems like poverty, lack of education, lack of access to opportunities. So when we start talking about vulnerability, we see that we are linking up more closely to the other development goals that United Nations set up for the world. And so basically, we have now 3 different initiatives. An initiative to fight climate change that's been around for about 25 years. An initiative to deal with disasters, been around a bit longer than that. And an initiative to have development goals set up for the entire planet. That's a more recent initiative. Ideally, those 3 initiatives should work together, but it's not that simple. It gets a bit more tricky, but that's the ultimate goal. People in the United Nations realize that, and they are trying to improve that communication among the 3 groups. Now, going back to the graph, one more point. So we see that the risk depends then on the exposure to the hazard, but it also depends on what kind of population we have. We were talking about Haiti and Dominican Republic. After Haiti and Dominican Republic, the hurricane goes its course and it hits Cuba. What happens in Cuba compared to Haiti? If we have 100 people killed in Haiti, how many people are going to be killed in Cuba, more likely? Probably 1, 2, or probably none, right? And you will say, wow, so Cuba must be very rich. No, they are not rich. So what happens to Cuba? Why are they so, why is the vulnerability of Cuban population so low? It doesn't have to do with wealth, so it looks like, no, because they are not wealthy. It has to do with something else. So that's a very important question. Why do we have so few people being impacted in Cuba compared to Haiti? And then the hurricane crosses Cuba and continues, and eventually it hits the United States. No, it hits the southern part of the United States. And then when it hits the United States, how many people are going to get killed? If we had 100 people killed in Haiti, we're probably going to have 0, 1, or 2 people killed in Cuba. And in the U.S., how many people killed? Probably about the same, no? Probably only a handful of people affected strongly by the hurricane. So we have two countries, United States and Cuba, that have more or less the same risk of being impacted by the hurricane. But the societies are very different, the political systems are very different, and yet the result seems to be similar. Okay? So that's a very interesting case study to compare and to analyze to understand how or why the vulnerability of the two societies seems to be more or less the same. So the question is, what are the factors affecting vulnerability? Now, that's not the topic of the class today, because that was the topic of the class yesterday and the day before yesterday. But we're going to touch on that. So when I ask you, what did Mari Carmen talk about, you correctly said, well, she talked about vulnerability, but she also talked about adaptation. Because when we talk about vulnerability, it's almost impossible not to talk about adaptation. And when we talk about adaptation, it's almost impossible not to talk about vulnerability, because the two of them are linked up. Why? Well, because in adaptation, what we want to do is to minimize the risk, okay? So if we want to minimize the risk, what do you think are our options? What can we do? So if we want to make this smaller, we have 3 different variables that we could try to affect, no? If we want to reduce the risk, we should try to reduce the hazards. We could reduce the exposure, or we could reduce the vulnerability. Either one of those 3 would reduce the risk, right? So either one of those 3 actions would be considered a good adaptation practice, okay? So the question is, can we reduce the physical hazards? I ask that to you. Can we reduce the number of hurricanes? Can we reduce the number of droughts? Theoretically, yes. In practice, it will be very expensive, very complex. And we're gonna, that's actually one of the last slides today, so keep that in mind, right? So there are things that we can do in theory, but in practice are very complicated to implement. But let's go back to the question of hurricanes. That's an important one. Can we reduce the number of hurricanes? That seems to be harder. Now, but think about the future. We cannot really reduce the number of hurricanes in the future, or can we? Okay, we could change the intensity of the storm.
Maybe in long term we can reduce the trend.
Exactly. So in the future, we might not be able to reduce the total number, but we can reduce the trend of what's happening, right? So maybe now, for this year, we cannot say, well, we're going to reduce the number of hurricanes. But 50 years from now, depending on our choices, we might have more or less hurricanes, right? If we continue to pollute the atmosphere, the models show that we're going to have more hurricanes. If we reduce the pollution to the atmosphere, the models suggest that we're going to have fewer hurricanes. So in the future, yes, we have the ability to reduce the hazards by making the right choices in terms of polluting the atmosphere, right? So that's the conclusion. We can adapt to the future by making choices today in terms of pollution, okay? If we pollute less, then the climate will be less severe in the future, and therefore we will be better adapted to those changes. That goes back to the first graph that I showed, no? The graph with the temperature, whether we want to be on the blue line or the red line. If we want to be on the blue line, then the adaptation needed is not so drastic. But if we are on the red line, the adaptation needed is a lot more drastic, because the amount of hazards is much higher. So we do affect the amount of physical hazards in the long term by the choices we make nowadays in terms of what we want to do with pollution in the atmosphere. Can we reduce the exposure to physical hazards? Can we reduce the exposure part? What do we need to do to reduce the exposure part? Exposure was related to what? It was related to geography, but more than geography, population. And what specifically about population? What do we care about population? Two important variables. First, how many? Right? Remember the story I told you about Mitch and Stan? Mitch hit the country of Guatemala where there was fewer people, and Stan where there were more people, and so the risk was different. And so we are interested about how many.
And also where they live, if they live in
Exactly, and where they live, right? And so the exposure has two variables that are extremely important. How many people and where they are located. If they happen to be in the path of the hurricane, they're going to be devastated. But if they happen to be away from the hurricane, they couldn't care less about that hurricane, right? They might care about other problems. Okay, so how many people there are results in more or less risk. Now, how many people are we? What happens to population in the world? How is population growing? It's exploding, no? The exponential growth of population has been well explained. But it's interesting to realize that the population is exploding in the globe, but really, if we look closer, it's only exploding in certain areas of the globe, no? Particularly in developing countries. If we look at developed countries and some developing countries, we see that the population is stable or even declining, right? And so population growth is related to economy of the country in a way, no? So how can we control for that? How could we reduce then exposure? You're thinking about it, but you don't want to say it. We should control the number of people, right? Did I say it? No, I didn't say that. No, you didn't hear that. When you are in a negotiation and you start talking about population, then it gets extremely tricky. Everybody's like, I know what the solution is, but I don't want to say it, right? So definitely the number of people in the planet matters. Matters not only because we are changing the exposure, it matters also because the more people we have, the more resources we need, and the more pollution we produce. Not only climate change, but all kinds of pollution.
But beyond that, there's a mass migration to cities, which actually concentrates potentially people in areas that are extremely vulnerable.
So there's another problem of urbanization, right? So it's not the same as having all people spread out than having everybody together in one specific place. There are pros and cons to each one of those.
I was going to say, it seems like it's better to have everybody in denser than spread out everywhere, having effects on the environment everywhere.
But for this case, if you have a ton of people in one area and that area gets affected, I mean, it's
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes. So the discussion is whether it's better or worse to have people concentrated or spread out. And if it is in terms of exposure to a extreme event, if you have them concentrated and the event happens to go through that area, then you can have a higher risk of a problem. If you have them spread out, then they have a better chance of surviving. But for other situations like waste management, like sewage management, it might be better to have them concentrated and spread out.
I don't necessarily agree with that, because when people are concentrated, they can...
Mm-hmm.
I was saying I don't necessarily agree with that concept, because when people are concentrated, they can concentrate their resources into reducing their exposure. When people are distributed across the landscape, they are more exposed, and they have a harder time protecting themselves.
Okay.
So
Okay.
just another
No,
thought.
that's true. That's true. If you have more people together and they are well organized, that will be the caveat, no? They need to be well organized. Then having them together might work better, no? Because they can put in their effort together, their money together, and build better infrastructure or better defenses against risks.
I have a small difficulty in understanding the concept of exposure. Isn't it in some sense narrow to always focus on population? What about other animals, other ecosystems? Why are we not bringing them on board when we are discussing about exposure?
Sure.
Human population can move, but ecosystems, if it is fixed, and that is very crucial for the entire economy or for the world as a whole, we cannot do anything about it.
Exactly. No, that's very true. I wonder if the PowerPoint is available already on the website. Did you see the coming slide? No, because there is a slide dealing with what you're talking about. No, but you're right. All the discussion so far has been dealing with human beings only. What about the rest of the planet? I mean, we are only one part of a huge ecosystem with so many species, no? Yes, that's very true. We need to also think about them. And we also need to think about impacts, adaptation to them. And like you said, humans might be able to move, not necessarily, not so much anymore. But animals and plants can move even less. And there is a specific graph to that coming up later in the afternoon. But you're very right. Let's keep that in mind. The focus so far has been on human beings, but we also care about the ecosystem. Not so much because we are conservationists, because we like animals, because we like the plants. Why do we care about ecosystems? Because we are selfish, and we want to have our species survive, and we know that we need the ecosystems. That's the explanation you give to people who don't like the animals and the plants. No, if you know that they are conservationists, then you go to them with the picture of the panda bear or the nice animal. But if you know that they are people who are more business oriented, like production oriented, then you explain to them, well, if you want to continue producing, you need that animal out there. You need that plant out there, because your productivity depends on that animal and that plant being out there. And so we do care about ecosystems, because those ecosystems are providing the supporting services that enable us to continue production. Yes? Mm-hmm.
I totally agree. I think probably most people here agree with that. But when you tell somebody that who doesn't have the same perception of value for ecosystems, that they don't believe you. I think until we can put a dollar value on ecosystem services, they mean nothing.
Yeah.
Except to people who study them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you can say, oh yes, this estuary is worth $100 billion a year, then that can make sense. But otherwise, if you say, these provide services to us, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Economists don't know how to value that.
No, I'm convinced that you're looking at ahead in the presentation, because you're discussing all the slides for the afternoon. But you're right. No, when we talk about economics, then we're talking about money. Show me the money, no, says that movie. But that situation becomes very tricky, no, because we need to put a value on things. So how much do we put? What's the cost of an estuary, like you were saying, no? Well, we can probably estimate that. What's the cost of a panda bear? No. What's the cost of any animal? What's the cost of a human being, right? Unfortunately, even though it sounds very extreme, the question comes down to that. When we want to add a value to all ecosystems, sooner or later, we're going to have to add a value to human lives, right? So sooner or later, the economy is going to be faced with the question, so how much do I put for a human being? If we kill 10 people, so how much is that, no? Exactly. And that's why I was saying that the graph that we showed before is so good, because it opens up the mind of many people that are already doing that, no? So how much is the cost of one human being? We're like, wow, what are you talking about? We've done it all these years, no? We already know that. So it's not that complicated. We can do it. Sorry. So anyway, let's go back to our train of thinking. But we're going to be discussing all these topics, so let's keep them in mind. We need to value things, because if we don't value things, then it's just a discourse, no? Only when we are able to show the value of an ecosystem service, then people react. I have a very quick story on that, just so I don't forget in the afternoon. In Guatemala, we are dealing with payment for ecosystem services, and we are dealing with convincing industries to pay for water. And we were telling them, okay, your water comes from that mountain. And they were saying, like, I don't know, right? It sounds okay, but it doesn't convince me. So we were able to convince the industry. So they were not really that willing to give money to pay for conservation of the mountain, because they kind of said, well, maybe true, but it doesn't really convince me that you're telling me that my water comes from there. So what we did is, well, I didn't do it, but the group working with this is, they added a tracer, they added a chemical to the water on top of the mountain. And then a few days later, that tracer showed up in the wells of the companies down in the valley. And that was proof enough for the company to say, oh yeah, my water comes from there. So here's the check, how much you want, okay? So it worked well. It worked well to give a proof that what we are saying is true, no? So people sometimes need a more visible proof that what we are saying really has some fundament, okay? So we talk about reducing physical hazards. We can do it in the long term. Reducing exposure. We can do it, but it's harder, right? We need to control population, not only the number of population, but where they live, okay? And that gets tricky, no? That's very tricky. Sometimes, and there are many stories I'm sure in your countries, I can tell you stories in my own country. Sometimes we determine that this specific town shouldn't be living there because they're right in the middle of whatever. They're right in the middle of a river that is going to flood the area. They're right in the middle of an area that's going to have a huge landslide and kill everybody. So what do? Well, you try to convince the people to move away from that area. That's extremely difficult to do, no? People are really rooted in their area, no? People are like, no, my grandfather lived here, and my father lived here, and I live here, and I want my grandchildren to live here. And then they die. The next year they die because there's a big landslide, no? And so it's a very tricky situation, but it's something that we need to deal with. How do we control for exposure? We need to control the number of people, and we need to control where they live. Very difficult, and to many societies that's unacceptable, right? No, we don't need to control that. Everybody should be free to live wherever they want, no? If they want to live in the ocean front because they love the view of the ocean, let them live there. Okay, let them live there, but if their houses get destroyed by a flood, don't ask for insurance from the government, because then my taxes are paying your wish to see the view of the ocean. And so there are so many different discussions and situations when it comes to exposure, no? We may have the freedom to live wherever we want, but then we should be able to take on the risk of our choices of where we want to live and pay for that risk, no? Insurance is a way to deal with that risk. Insurance is a way in which we spread out the risk to other people, no? And we're going to talk about insurance also later when we talk about economic analysis. But anyway, let's go back to this. And so the first one, we can do it, but in the long term. This one, we can do it, but much more difficult. So we focus on this, no? So when we deal about adaptation, when we talk about adaptation, we are dealing with reducing vulnerability of the population. And so the big question is, why are people vulnerable? What are the determinants of vulnerability? And luckily, I don't need to go through that because you already heard that yesterday from Maria Carmen. But before you ask your question, then can you summarize to us why are people vulnerable? What are the two determinants of vulnerability?
Well, in fact, I was going to ask about the last topic regarding the control of growth population. It's just like I think that I wouldn't release to any method because that could lead to very cruel methods to control the growth. Even we could think about very controversial things like wars as something with positive results, which well, I wouldn't do. I wouldn't like to do that, and so I think it's a very sensitive issue, and even the very worst impacts of climate change could be seen as something positive. So I wouldn't release so open to any method of control.
Yeah, it's complicated. And we were talking about United Nations trying to bring together the different initiatives. Well, United Nations has an initiative on population. They meet every year to try to figure out what to do with population. And so ideally, that initiative should link up with the people from climate change. But who wants to tell me what makes a population vulnerable? But there's a question here. But can you answer what are the two main determinants of vulnerability, or how do we measure vulnerability? ¿Y qué les dijo ayer Mari Carmen?
Yo creo que la vulnerabilidad depende de la amenaza, ante que estás amenazado. No es lo mismo una población amenazada por volcanes o erupción de volcanes que por lluvias extremas. Okay. Entonces ahí tiene que haber una relación. Okay. Y eso también depende.
¿Cómo se llama esa variable? You probably studied that variable yesterday. So she's saying that some things affect me, but some other things don't affect me. So how do we call that? Sensitivity. No, that's a sensitivity. So that's the first variable that is important with vulnerability, sensitivity. ¿Y tenía una pregunta o esa era? Okay. So sensitivity is an important thing, no? There are some things that are impacting to me and some other things that are not, right? So if I'm not a farmer who depends on rainfall, then my sensitivity to changes in rainfall is much lower, right? If I'm in the business of selling boats, so flooding is good to me, no? Because I'm going to sell more boats. So the sensitivity there is very low to flooding. An extreme case, but it's true, no? And so sensitivity is one factor. The other factor that is important related to vulnerability is what? You talked about that extensively yesterday, I'm sure. ¿Ah, ya? Llegaste allá.
I think it's how people manage to cope with adaptive capacity.
How people cope?
Yes.
And how do we call that? What's the technical term for that?
Adaptive capacity.
Adaptive capacity, exactly. So those are the two main variables that we need to deal with. Sensitivity and adaptive capacity, okay? And adaptive capacity sounds very similar to adaptation, no? Even the name. So that's when we start talking about the two things very close to each other. So basically, when we talk about reducing vulnerability as a means for adaptation, we are talking about increasing the adaptive capacity of society and understanding better the sensitivity of different groups to different events. Okay? Okay, so let's move on. Okay? So we basically need to understand what are the drivers of vulnerability. Okay? So the same question I was asking you before. We know that vulnerability then is determined by sensitivity and by adaptive capacity. But let's be more specific. Why are people in Haiti more vulnerable than people in Cuba? Why are people in Haiti more vulnerable than people in Cuba? So poverty. Is poverty a determinant of vulnerability? What did Maria Carmen tell you yesterday? Yes or no? If you reduce poverty, do you reduce vulnerability? It depends, no? Not necessarily. So there is a link there, but not necessarily. Sometimes you reduce poverty and people remain vulnerable because there are other factors like how people are organized, right? That's an extremely important factor. So what are the determinants of vulnerability? That's something that we need to discuss in the rest of the day, no? We know that vulnerability has to do with gender. We know that in many countries, women are more vulnerable than men. Do women agree here? We know that in other countries, it's the other way around. Men, we are very vulnerable because our wives don't let us do whatever we want, okay? Age is important. Health, social status, ethnicity, whether you belong to an indigenous group or not, that makes a huge difference in many countries, right? And institutions, how people are organized. A question here? Mm-hmm.
Just a comment. Cuba is not the best example for this, but because in Cuba we are very poor.
You are Cuban?
Yeah.
Ah, excellent.
We both.
Two Cubans here.
But the government is many.
En español.
Is very concerned about all of the people. We in front of a hurricane or a disaster, we evacuate everyone, whatever he wants or not. We evacuate everyone.
Okay.
It's a typical, a particular case.
No, but it's important because then you're saying that the solution you have found there is basically to organize people and to have people responding, right? If the government gives an order to evacuate, then everybody evacuates, right? In my country, if the government says evacuate, everybody's like, no. Okay, so this is important because I don't want to evacuate, but the government is forcing me to do it. So the government is taking away my liberty to decide what to do. Okay, so people don't like it, but they do it. So, but this is an important issue, no? So if we want to reduce risk, it might have to do with taking away some of the freedom that people wish to have, sometimes, under certain circumstances. So is that valid or not? When do we want the government to take that right, to take away freedom from me? Difficult, no? But that's the kind of thinking that we need to start doing if we want to think about adapting to extreme events. One more and then we continue here.
Hello, Bob. There is something that I don't understand. Sometimes you consider vulnerability as a function of exposure, susceptibility, or sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And sometimes exposure is taken out of vulnerability. So I don't understand.
Very good question. He's saying, well, sometimes I read in a book that vulnerability has to do with exposure. But in some other places, and you're telling me that no, exposure is a different thing. Well, your question is in minds of everybody, no? There are several situations here. On one hand, the IPCC report number 4, published in 2007, had one definition of vulnerability that included exposure. But then in 2014, in the 5th report, that definition changed. After people from climate change met with people from risk analysis, they decided to remove the exposure from the vulnerability definition. But this was just a decision, and some people might agree with it, and some people might not agree with it. So that's still not written in stone. So it might be that in the 6th report coming up next year, they might go back and say, no, vulnerability has to do with exposure. So basically, your question is correct because there is some uncertainty in this terminology, and in the past years, it has changed a lot. And so for some people in some areas, you might read that, yes, vulnerability has to do with exposure, but others might say, no, now the definition is that vulnerability doesn't deal with exposure. So it's basically the sources and the timing. If you read something from older literature, you might find what you just said. If you read something from more recent literature, then vulnerability and exposure are separated. Anyway, let's go on here and just emphasize 2 points. One is that adaptation needs are highly diverse, right? I think we all agree with this, and they are context specific. So basically, if we want to talk about adaptation in a group like this, I cannot give you a recipe, no? I cannot give you a PowerPoint that says you need to do A, B, C, and D to adapt. I can give you some guidelines, I can give you some ideas of what has been done in certain places, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to work with your own country, with your own state, with your own community, because adaptation is going to be dependent on your own current situation, right? That's number one important thing to remember. And number two is that we're talking here about adaptation to future climate. And again, future climate is going to be different in one location than in another. And so we need to know what the future climate is going to be like in our specific location. But more importantly, the level of adaptation that we need is going to depend on how extreme that future climate is going to be. And that, in turn, depends on the level of pollution that we put out to the atmosphere. And so that's where we come with a high level of uncertainty, right? The future climate is still very uncertain because it depends on our own decisions on how much we want to continue polluting the atmosphere. And so the level of adaptation that we need still dependent on that decision, okay? We signed an agreement in Paris, the Paris Agreement, saying that we're going to stop the pollution. So at least we have the intention to do that. Now, whether that can be translated into action still needs to be seen, no? So let's go into more detail about adaptation before we go to lunch. We go to lunch at 12:30, no? Okay, so what options do we have for adaptation? We have three different groups of activities. We can focus on trying to change our surroundings, our physical surroundings, by constructing things, by building things. So we can have engineering solutions. We can also have solutions changing our surroundings, but not by physical constructions, but by biological constructions, no? Like what we saw at the beginning. Instead of building a gate to stop the ocean, I can plant trees to try to stop the ocean. But in both cases, we are trying to change the structure of our surroundings. We can also change the way people behave, the way people react, by educating them, by giving them information, by trying to change their behavior. Very difficult, but it can be done, right? So that will be in the social realm of adaptation. And we can also change the way that people interact with each other. That has to do with institutions. So in this case, the word institution is used in a broad sense. Institution relates to how we all relate to each other, what kind of rules, whether written or oral, we have in order to interact with each other. So if we change any one of these, we can change the way our society works, and we can change possibly how we confront problems about climate change. So, seeing that list, then the question comes, so how do we know if what we are doing is working or not, right? So we decided to change how we are organized. Now, was that good or not? We decided to plant trees here. Was that good or not? We decided to invest $10 million in building this huge gate. Did that do any good at all or not? So assessing whether adaptation is good or not is extremely important because we need to know whether we are going in the right direction. Now, I used to be the PI in a project that was called Effective Adaptation Practices for Farmers. And I'm going to show you some data in the afternoon about that project. So the title of our research was Effective Adaptation Practices. And very soon we realized that we had made a mistake by titling our project Effective Adaptation Strategies. Because what's an effective adaptation strategy? How can you define whether something is effective or not? It's very difficult. First, you need to have indicators. But then how do you choose those indicators? And more importantly, at the end, something can be effective for somebody, but it can be negative for somebody else, right? The extreme situation, we were working with farmers growing coffee. An adaptation for farmers growing coffee could be to stop planting coffee altogether. That's an adaptation, right? Because coffee is not suitable anymore in my area. So let's abandon coffee. So that's an adaptation practice. But to the coffee buyer in Europe, how does that look? That doesn't look like a good adaptation practice, no? Because if everybody decides to stop growing coffee, then I'm out of business. And then all the people who wanted to sip coffee in Europe and the US are going to be like, what happened to my coffee? No? And so one adaptation practice can be very positive for a group, but it could be negative for another group. And so assessing adaptation is extremely important, but it's also a tricky situation. ¿Tenemos el micrófono o no? Aquí atrás.
In few words, adaptation is public policy. In few words, adaptation is public policy.
Public policy? Yeah, one of the options for adaptation is changing public policy. Yeah, one possibility for adaptation is to change the way society is organized. That requires public policy. One option for adaptation, we're going to actually discuss that in the afternoon, is to try to change our model of development. Right? Yesterday you talked a lot about development. What's development? Well, what do we mean by a developed country and a developing country? Are we happy with the way that the system is running right now, or do we want a completely new system? So that requires changes, huge changes in policy, no? Completely changing the way we see our world, but that might be required for adaptation. Right now, what we see is that even within developed and developing countries, and I'm going to show you a graph in a minute about that, you see huge differences, no? In a very wealthy country, you see poor people who are being left behind. And in a very poor country, you see extremely wealthy people who live better than anybody else in the world. And so you see a lot of differences, and then you start questioning about what kind of policy do we want to try to improve that situation. Now, one more important concept here, maladaptation. What if something goes wrong? What if we decide to change something and it didn't work? Well, that could be regarded as maladaptation. Now, it could be a maladaptation because I didn't know. I tried something and it didn't work. But it could be a maladaptation on purpose. Like, for example, quitting the coffee farming, right? It was a good adaptation for me, but it was a maladaptation for the coffee buyer in Europe. And so maladaptation is also important. We need to realize that some things can go wrong. We can make decisions, but we are making decisions here on an area that is highly uncertain. And so we are trying to manage a society. We are trying to manage how people think, how people behave, how people interact. And so it's not a simple situation, and sometimes we might end up with decisions that are not the best ones. An excellent example of a possible maladaptation is migration. And that's a very important topic now related to climate change. So if we talk about migration, is that a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think? We were talking about migration of people and then animals. I'm going to show you a graph later. But what do you think about migration? Is that good or bad? It depends, no? It depends. For example, if I'm the head of a family, and I migrate to the U.S., and I'm happy there because I'm working and I find a new wife, that usually happens, right? And so for me it was great, right? But for the family who stay with the wife, who stay alone with 4 or 5 children, might not be that good, no? And this is a true story. This happens a lot, no? Most men who migrate end up finding another woman up in where they come, and so migration is a situation that becomes very, very complex.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. My contribution about that is that if the family or whoever is migrating migrating to a farming community, it's okay. I'm talking as an agriculturist now. Yeah, but if the person is going to look for greener pastures in cities, it's not good. It will lead to a phenomenon known as aging farming population, whereby the average age of the farmers will be very high. And there are projections about how long it will take for each country to reach the aging farming population full-blown scenario. Like in Nigeria, by 2050, is expected to reach that level if measures are not taken to curtail it. Thank you.
So migration can be good or bad, depends on how you see it and how it happens. It's a very complex issue. In the new IPCC report that's going to start next year, they're going to have a whole chapter on migration. So look forward to that. Anybody here has raised their hand? And we could spend a lot of time talking about migration, but we need to move on. We'll hear one more comment, and then we'll move on. Oh, you have one? Oh.
Can I give a personal example?
Sure.
In the 1920, my grandparents came from northeast Brazil to São Paulo. They were running away from drought. My father was born here in São Paulo. And I was the first one in the family to go to the university, and I'm here now. So because my great-parents
success story
ran away from the drought. And now I'm back there studying this phenomenon and trying to understand whether some adaptation measures could be really effective, I don't know, good for them to stay there or no. So this is a personal story on migration.
Sure, no, and it goes back to what we were hearing from you over there. It depends on how it happens, no? If the whole family moves, it's different than if only the head of the family moves, no? That's a completely different story. If they move by force or not, if they move to a better place, what's a better place? So there are so many factors that it's a whole different topic to discuss. One more?
For me, I was saying that it depends. I agree with those ones who said it depends on many factors why migration can be justified and not. However, also adaptation in practice, it is location specific. That it depends. People adapt according to where they live and to circumstances. For example, for communities which farm, you may find that the way how they adapt in the highlands, it's different. It's different to the enterprise they are doing, like a coffee, banana. It's totally location specific. Even migration, that is, those people who it's as an option, it is always informed by either the geography and the benefit of the enterprise somebody is doing in terms of the sector.
Completely agree. Just one point to add to that, going back to something we heard before, whether we have people spread out in rural areas or concentrated in urban cities, we have different adaptation options. So we need to look at those two cases as different options. No. So this is the end of the first part. So we are doing a little bit slower than I wanted, but that's okay. But basically, I wanted to close this first part by showing this graphs. And this is brand new information that just came out last week in a paper in Science. I was lucky to read a summary of it in my email on the way here. But the graphs are very interesting. Now, this is a group of people who are trying to estimate vulnerability and risk to climate change in the U.S. And they've done it by counties. And so the analysis is as detailed as possible by counties. And you see here, for example, the damages expected in agricultural yields, the damages expected in mortality, energy expenditures, coastal damage, crime, and so forth. So they analyze different variables to see how climate could impact different aspects of that society. And then they added all those into one index over here. So this is the index that shows the total direct damages expected from climate change in the U.S. And you see many interesting things, but I want to highlight two things. One is that a big part of the U.S. is in green color, okay? And green means negative damages. Negative damages is a double negative, meaning those people are going to be better off with climate change, okay? So especially people in the north, where it's very cold, of course, are going to be better off with warmer climate, right? The same thing happens in Canada, actually, when you do the analysis. At least in the first years of climate change, you're better off because you have a warmer climate. So not everybody suffers from climate change. A good portion of the population actually increases their well-being because of climate change. But another good portion is in dark colors, meaning a lot of people suffer. And it's important to see the distribution. Most of the people suffering are in the southeast, okay? So the southeast, for several reasons. One is because this part is already hot. So if it gets hotter, of course, it's going to get more complicated. But interestingly enough, also, that area is the poorest area of the country. And so the people receiving the highest impacts are also the poorest people in the country. And that is shown in this other graph, derived from the same data. In this graph, they organize the counties. Counties are like municipalities in the U.S. From the poorest counties to the wealthiest counties in the U.S. And this is the impact or the damage expected. And so you see that the poorest has the more spread, but the average is also higher. To average these points, unfortunately here it was not shown, the averages go more or less like this. Okay, so the wealthier the county, the less impacts they are gonna get, and the poorest the county, the higher the damages that they can expect. And so even in the wealthiest country in the world, we have people who are richer and poorer, and we see that more wealth, the less impact, the more poverty, the higher impact. So interesting, you can look up the article in Science if you want to see more details. I don't have the details. I only saw these two graphs. I didn't read the paper. So,
I just want to, if you could show us, please, again, the last picture of the maps of USA.
Esta?
Yeah, I was interested because in the last figure, with total damage per country by GDP, if you see sometimes there are abrupt changes in the total in the damages. There's no
gradual change.
There's not a gradual change. For example, near New York, you can see
so you
change.
can see a border here that changes. No?
Yeah,
from,
for example,
from
center of USA, it's gradual, but near, for example, Texas, West Texas, and New York, you can see abrupt change in damage.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I only saw the graphs. I haven't read the paper. I'm gonna read it for sure, but this is important for several reasons. One is because it shows that even in the wealthiest country, we have problems of differences of poverty and wealth, but also because this is a very good attempt to try to put numbers to vulnerability and risk. And that's very hard to do. That's extremely hard to do, especially at this detail level, county level here. We are actually trying to do the same in Guatemala. We are trying to come up with a vulnerability map at the municipal level in Guatemala. And the first thing is that we find out is that we don't have enough data. We don't have enough information. And so it's an interesting result. It might be that it's not the best result, it might be that it can be improved, but at least it's a very good attempt to try to put numbers to all these variables that we've been talking about, how to quantify vulnerability, how to quantify risk in the face of climate change. Okay, so here's the reference for the article, so look it up and read it. Okay, second part of the class. We have half an hour to try to catch up. But if not, we move in the afternoon, no problem. Because the afternoon part is much shorter. Planning and implementation. So we know that we want to adapt. How do we proceed? Well, First of all, it's important to realize what I mentioned in the morning, that now we are transitioning from a phase of awareness, so we already agree that we need to adapt, to a phase of actual planning. Okay, so what do we do now? But also important to remember that we even had a phase of denial some years ago. I mentioned to you, at the beginning when we talk about climate change, it was not a good thing to talk about adaptation, because that was a way to recognize that the wealthy countries were not going to be doing enough to try to solve the problem. Now we know that even if they do their best, we're still going to face the problem, so we need to adapt. Okay? Now, we have changed from the phase of awareness to the change of actual planning, in part because of the work of international organizations, scientific reports like the IPCC, and media coverage. That's important also. No, media usually raises awareness in the population, sometimes for the bad and sometimes for the good, right? But media is an extremely important ally in this issue, no? If we are able to convince media that this is an important news, then they cover it, and if they cover it, then we reach out many more people than if we just talk to a conference room, for example. And so getting the involvement of media is important, and we have seen that in the past years. Media are more and more involved because they see the value in this kind of news, no? And so basically, because of all of these situations, now we are seeing more of adaptation processes. In general, like we were saying before, people in general are experiencing more extreme events. People in general are seeing that things are kind of odd, at the least, to say so. So in general, people are more open to saying, well, if there is something happening, we should probably do something about it. Now, this is a fairly recent process, like I have mentioned before, so there are not really that many examples that we can see where adaptations have been gone through planning and implementation. But we're going to give some guidelines here. First of all, it's important to realize that adaptation needs to happen at different levels. The first level that is important to understand is the international level. So there is a lot of action happening in the international arena to try to promote adaptation. For example, there are many multilateral agencies like UNDP, USAID, World Bank, putting out money there for countries to start their planning and their implementation of adaptation plans. The same convention on climate change has initiatives. For example, for the least developed countries, the poorest countries of the world, they have what they call the NAPAs. That's funding specific for these countries to develop their adaptation plans. And in general, for developing countries, they have the NAPs, or the funding to try to help countries develop their adaptation plans. And so in general, we see that there's a lot of international push, especially for developing countries, to start planning for adaptation at the national level. The Paris Agreement itself, in Article 7, talks about adaptation at length, and that's important. And that's your homework. No, if you haven't read the Paris Agreement, look for it and read especially Article 7 that deals with adaptation. Contrary to the Kyoto Protocol, for example, that was focusing mainly on mitigation, the Paris Agreement also focused on mitigation. That's the main objective. But there's a very long part on adaptation, a very detailed part on adaptation. The Paris Agreement even asked countries to present a frequent report on their adaptation needs. And so countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement are now forced to report in a frequent way, at least every 5 years, ideally every 2 years, what they are doing in terms of adaptation at the national level. And so with the entry of action of the Paris Agreement, there's going to be more activity now in the adaptation arena, more countries now being active in terms of coming up with plans and trying to put those plans to work. So, planning for adaptation. Many countries have started their national plans for adaptation. I'm going to take a few minutes just to quickly explain to you what happened in Guatemala, not because Guatemala is the ideal case, but just to show you how complicated it can be. In Guatemala, I mentioned to you that because of all this extreme weather that we had in the previous decade, politicians were very open to passing a law. And so we had a climate change law that passed in 2013. That climate change law mandated the creation of a National Council on Climate Change, which was a very good thing because that council brings people together from different sectors. So it sounds like a good step. And the law also mandates the country to create a national plan for climate change. And that national plan should include an adaptation plan and a mitigation plan. And so, at least for Guatemala, we have an internal law that mandates that we need to plan for adaptation. And so, how do we do it? Well, the law mandates that the council should head that process. But the law also recognizes that the Ministry of Environment is the head ministry that deals with climate change. And so it mandates both the Ministry of Environment and the council to work together to create that plan. The law stated that the country had 1 year to create the plan. So the law was passed in 2013 at the end of that year. So by the end of 2014, we were supposed to have a plan. It didn't happen, of course. I'm going to go quickly through several slides here just to show you that it became really complex. No? At first, the Ministry of Environment received that charge of creating that plan within a year. And so the first thing that they thought is, well, the best thing is to hire a consultant. And actually, there were 2 international agencies willing to put in money to hire consultants. And so there were 2 consulting groups working simultaneously. That was not a good thing. That was a bad thing because they were competing instead of collaborating. But at the end, we had 2 consulting groups producing a report. The report was presented to the council, but it showed to be not good enough. The council said, no, we did not what we wanted. And so basically, the consultant ended up handing in the work to the council, and the council then decided that they needed to continue working on producing a new draft. The new draft was generated in 2015, was still not complete, was rejected as incomplete. Basically, the plan was not complicated. I'm going to show you quickly at the end the plan. Basically, the plan was working in different sectors, the health sector, the agricultural sector. And for every sector, it had a table. And the table shows some activities that needed to be completed. And the activities needed to have indicators to try to estimate whether the activities were being done correctly or not, and to estimate the success of the adaptation practices. And so the assessment of the adaptation was the tricky part. Agreeing on those indicators was the tricky part that we haven't been able to really come to an agreement. Basically, since 2014 that we started this process, we have been discussing at different levels with consultant groups within the council. But still, up to now, we haven't been able to come up with a plan. The plan is still so-so, even though it was approved last year. The plan was approved with some numbers missing in there, basically because we wanted to go to the COP meeting in Marrakech and show that we had a plan. And so there was a political drive to approve the plan. So we approved it last year. I say we because I'm part of the council that is dealing with this situation. But basically, we approved a plan that was missing some indicators to evaluate whether the adaptation process was happening or not. So last year, we approved the plan and said, okay, we're going to give 1 more year to try to complete that process. We are still in the process of doing that. But in general, it has proven to be very difficult to complete the plan. Basically, for 2 main reasons, several reasons, but 2 important ones. First, it has proven to be very difficult to get different government institutions to talk to each other. And so when we're talking about adaptation, even though we can talk about sectors, the health sector, the infrastructure sector, the agricultural sector, and we can find or we can assign 1 ministry to each one of the sectors, most likely when we talk about adaptation plan, that ministry is going to have to talk to other ministries, to other offices, no? And that just proved to be very complicated in Guatemala. I don't know if it's going to be the same in your countries, but just getting to have one officer from the Ministry of Agriculture talk to an officer in the Ministry of Infrastructure, for example, was very complicated. And to coordinate the two of them to try to come up with a single indicator for their adaptation goal was complicated. So communication among different government institutions was a challenge. And of course, the other challenge was the communication between government and non-government, between government institutions and academia, private sector, NGOs. That was even more complicated because then we would have many more different interests. And so in general, the summary of this story, a very quick story, is that it is complicated. When we are planning for adaptation at the national level, we need coordination among institutions within the government and between government and non-government, and that is just tricky. So the same way that adaptation from the scientific point of view requires the coordination of physical and social scientists, the same thing happens in society. When we're talking about adaptation, we are forced to try to bring together people from different views and different sectors, and that just happens to be highly complicated. Let me see if I can just quickly show you here, as an example, this is the plan. This is the document that was approved last year. So we do have a document, but it's still incomplete. I just wanted to show you, for example, how adaptation was organized around different sectors. Probably hard to see from the back, but here we have the chapter on adaptation. So we have one section on human health, one section on coastal areas, another section on agriculture, cattle, and food security. Then another section on forest resources, infrastructure, and water management. So those were the 6 sectors that we decided to work on for our adaptation plan. How did we decide that? Well, in part because those are the traditional sectors that groups like the IPCC emphasize, but in part because we deem those sectors as being the most important for our country. So, of course, it is important to realize that different countries will have different sectors. Like we said before, adaptation is very country-specific, and so different plans for different countries will have different areas of focus. Okay, so difficulties, I already mentioned, the main difficulties in Guatemala have been the communication of different sectors and different institutions. So just a few minutes again to get some feedback from you, any experiences that you can share from your own
I have a question.
work.
Just you work in your national plan for Guatemala?
Do what?
Did you work? Did you work on the national plan for Guatemala?
I?
Yeah.
Myself?
Yeah.
A little
Yeah,
bit,
you,
yes.
you.
Yes, yeah, I work basically in the agricultural part, but for example, we had a hard time with the health part, public health. So when we approached the Ministry of Health and say, hey, we need to plan for adaptation to climate change, they said, what? What is that, adaptation to climate change? I have enough work now, I have enough problems now, dealing with public health, dealing with keeping our hospitals open, dealing with keeping enough medicines in our hospitals. So I have enough problems, don't bring me a new problem. No, if your problem is 50 years from now, then I don't care about it. I care about the immediate problems. And so the health sector was one sector that was very difficult to complete, basically because the Ministry of Health was so busy with so many other immediate problems that they really didn't care much about this, putting some people in the effort of thinking, what can we do in the planning for 25 or 50 years into the future, okay? So health was a complicated area. Anybody else that could share a quick story about planning for adaptation in your own country. We're talking about the country level. The next slide, we're going to talk about the local level. But any other experiences, any other countries that have already an adaptation plan in place? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in Bangladesh we have a national adaptation program of action. It has 6 pillars.
So it's by sector also?
Yeah.
The sectors are pretty much the same, or?
Almost same. I mean, food security, social protection, comprehensive disaster management, low carbon development in the society, something like that. But recently we found that 57% of adaptation measure taken by community people, which is supported by government official and NGO, are irrelevant. Yeah, that is the problem, you know. Yeah.
Okay, so the planning at the national level, when it moves to the local level, doesn't seem to match up with what they...
There is a lack of collaboration and coordination. We don't have strong monitoring and evaluation team. There is a lack of coordination among ministry departments, which is a very challenging thing for us for making strong adaptation process in the local level.
Yeah, that's very common to see in different countries, no? A coordination of vertical, a lack of coordination in the vertical level, but also the horizontal level, being deemed as one of the main barriers to implementing this plan.
And recently Bangladesh lost $67 million as a part of adaptation finance. Yeah,
from international sources?
Yeah, that's because of climate finance governance corruption. Yeah, that is the problem, you know.
Okay. Yeah, this situation is important. Access to international funding, no? I was just talking about money from UNFCCC and other sources to do planning and to do adaptation. Well, there is a vicious circle there that is also based on corruption. But in general, what we see is that the poorer countries are the ones in most need of this international funding.
Exactly.
But because they are poor countries, usually their governments are not so well organized to access the international financing. So even if corruption was not there, but it is. But even without corruption, usually poor countries have weak governments that are not well organized to access the financing available internationally. And so we have a negative situation in which, because I'm so poor that I don't have the resources to try to access the money that will help me get out of that situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more, and then we move on to local. What did I do with my...
Yeah. In the case of Kenya, I think we have a climate change adaptation strategy that was passed by Parliament in 2012. Although I'm not privy to the details that are contained in it, but most likely there could be gaps, because I remember in the process of having it passed in Parliament, some of the MPs who are influential had to be taken aside, like organize a retreat for them, just like to convince them to influence others to make it go through. And whenever such like things happen, you know, people are given some allowances to sit somewhere and like a corrupt deal kind of, so that they influence others. So the content may be of doubt, may not be quality. And beyond just having it in place, the implementation aspect has been a problem, because they have formed an institution, a climate change research center, a separate institution. We have the Ministry of Environment, where the meteorology lies, and we have the authority, National Disaster Response Authority on its own. So there is always conflict of interest, because most funding in climate change the projects in climate change are well funded. So there's always a war of who should do what whenever there's a disaster, for instance, who should come in. So I think the implementation aspect is the most crucial, not the strategy itself. Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to implementation, another comment that relates to what you're saying is that climate change started as an environmental problem, an environmental issue, and so in most countries, the focal point for climate change is housed within the Ministry of Environment. And at least in Guatemala, and I'm sure it's the same in many of your countries, environmental issues are not the most important issues, and therefore the Ministry of Environment is not the most important ministry. In fact, in Guatemala, the Ministry of Environment is one of the smallest, if not the smallest, of all the ministries. And so they have very limited personnel, very limited funding. And so having climate change housed within the environmental issue has made it be a small issue compared to other bigger issues in the country. And so when it comes to implementation, not only of adaptation plan, but in general, any actions on climate change, we find in Guatemala at least that there is very little political power within the ministry to develop activities. And so trying to convince people and in general government that climate change is not only an environmental problem, but it's in general a problem that deals with health, with infrastructure, with food security. So in general, climate change turns out to be a security problem for the country. Only when the countries start looking at climate change in that sense, then they might provide more resources for the planning to be more effective and better implemented. Now, that's at the national level. So at national level, we have the complication of governments moving much slower than what we want sometimes. Now, what about planning at the subnational level? Well, planning at the subnational level is highly dependent on the roles and structures of that level of government in different countries. In other words, when we talk about the subnational level, we're talking about subnational governments. So it depends on how those governments work in different countries. So we observe a wide range of responses on adaptation plans from local governments. In general, the theory says that the more local the planning, the better the outcome should be. But in practice, that's not necessarily the case. There are many examples, good examples, of how communities have organized themselves to adapt to different issues on climate change. And that is desirable in general, because we have said so many times this morning that adaptation is locally defined. No? We need to know what the local problems are, what the local resources are to come up with the adaptation plan. And so ideally, the more local the plans, the better off we are. The main limitation here would be the connection between the local plan with the regional government plan with the national government plan. And so that vertical integration sometimes becomes very tricky, because sometimes what the locals want does not necessarily match what the government said that they were going to do. And so that vertical integration can become tricky at times. And so at the local level, we need to ask or think about how do we understand the local circumstances? Who was the one assessing the local circumstances? Did we have everybody participate? Or did we have only the leaders participate? Who are the leaders? Who are the right leaders for the community? How was the local knowledge used? So we know what are the circumstances, but do we know what people know locally? It's important to realize that not necessarily only the external knowledge is important. Oftentimes, it's more important to know what people already know, to try to build on that local knowledge. Who took the initiative to do the plan? Why do people started to do an adaptation plan? Is it because the central government told them to do so or forced them to do so? Or is it because they realized that they needed a plan? No? That makes a huge difference. No? If you are told to do something and you do it because you have to do it, or if you do it because you know that you see the need to do the plan, right? How much outside help was needed? Were we able to do our own plan on our own, or did we need somebody from outside to come and help us do the plan? So those questions are important. And in general, again, the more local the planning, the better, in theory. But in practice, there are many tricky situations that need to be solved also at the local level. Now, very quickly, before lunch, and I'm sorry I'm taking a few minutes from your lunch, conclusions from Working Group 2 on planning. There is no single approach to adaptation planning because of the complex, diverse, and context-dependent nature of adaptation to climate change. So we cannot give a recipe on how to do an adaptation plan. A combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches should be used. So we should try to integrate as much as possible what the central government says with what the local people are saying. Now, that's said easily, but it's not so easy to implement. Information and knowledge on climate change risk from various stakeholders and organizations are essential resources for making adaptation planning. And so basically, the adaptation planning should arise from the perception of people to the risk. And we're going to talk more about that in the afternoon. Really, people should come up with a plan because they see that there is a risk that they need to reduce. So people should come up with a plan not because they are told to do so, but basically because they realize the situation that they are in a risky situation. Adaptation planning should be a dynamic, iterative learning process linking actions at different levels, national, subnational, and local. And again, that can be the tricky part, know how to integrate what the national plan says with the local government, with what the community wants to do. Okay, so this is a good point to finish the morning. We're going to talk a little bit more about implementation in the afternoon and then move to discuss more extensively about opportunities, constraints, and limits. That's going to be the main topic in the afternoon about adaptation. And we close with a brief analysis on economics of adaptation. So let's go for lunch, and I'll see you here at 2 p.m. Thank you.